Yeah, that's right. We're going to talk about the Iliad today. Why are we going to talk about the Iliad? Isn't the Iliad just some sort of crazy fictitious work that's like 2,000 years old or whatever they say right now and written by some dude named Homer? And what the hell does this have to do with anything in history? Like, isn't it fictitious? And yeah, so far as I have been concerned personally, up until about maybe 6, 7 years ago, the Iliad, as far as I was concerned, was a fictitious work. It was just a story. And why wouldn't you believe it's just a story? The Iliad is filled with a lot of, normal mortal stuff. The story of the Achaeans and the Trojans just fighting. I mean, there's nothing weird about that. All of the stuff that is described generally in all the battles, of which there's a lot of descriptive stuff in the Iliad, a lot of that stuff is down to earth. There's no real, there's not a whole lot of, if you were to just read the war parts, and just the descriptions of the armor and the weapons and that kind of stuff, it sounds like, yeah, maybe this is a historical account. But what changes the flavor of the Iliad is that we find a ton of god drama baked within the poem. And the gods don't play a minor role. It's not like, one soldier prays to a god and miraculously it rains the next day or whatever. It's not like that. The gods are literally interacting with individual people throughout the entire story, right? We have Zeus doing things. We have Aphrodite doing things. We have Pallas Athene doing things. We have Ares, Ares is up. There's gods all over the place, and they are not insubstantial. They matter big time. So, when you start hearing all of that kind of stuff, it kind of makes it hard to want to take the Iliad seriously. So I don't fault anybody for not really looking at and or studying the Iliad when it comes to your own ancient historical studies. But what I want to do in this show is I want to maybe turn that around. So what I want to do is I'm just going to give a very basic concept of the Iliad. We're not going to go into any kind of an in-depth weird study about that stuff, at least not in this show, because that would take 12 bajillion hours. And if I'm honest, there's just better people out there doing that stuff anyway. What I want to focus on the show relative to the Iliad today is I want to point out oddities that even the most in-depth Iliad researchers maybe don't know about or haven't taken seriously for whatever reason. What I want to do is I want to show that there are reasons to read the Iliad, there are reasons to pay attention to the Iliad with respect to trying to figure out and piece together what has happened in our history. Now, this would obviously be the general history over there, the Eurasian Mediterranean area, but all of that's important. Because one of the problems that we face when it comes to research really all over the planet, I mean, this is all over the place, which is why this is important. And that problem is human migration, cultural migration. Where did all of these people come from? Where did they go? And why did they end up where they ended up? Now, the mainstream right now, apparently, has all of this figured out. You can go right now to all of these mainstream books and sites, and they will have these nice, beautiful arrows pointing and swirling around exactly where every single ancient culture migrated from and to. For the mainstream historian, these migrations are more or less figured out. The problem is that point of view is completely unscientific, and really, when you get down to it, once you start looking at a lot of these human migration patterns that the mainstream purports to be real, to be the solid truth, they're garbage. There are so many problems with all of their little arrows pointing and going all over the place, all over these continents, that it's hilarious that anybody wasted their time publishing this at all. One of the things that you find when you start to look into human migration, yeah, I know, we're talking about the Iliad, but this is important, and I want to set the stage. But one of the things that we find when we really start to question human migration is we run into some very interesting problems. And just for example, let me just pull this one out and then we'll move on. So for example, right now we have We have the steppe people, right? They're coming out of the north. There's this weird Nordic white race that comes out of the north and it sweeps down and it goes into, Europe, Asia, etc., North Africa, and it invades, right? And these people are generally called barbarians or vandals or whatever garbage thing that mainstream calls them. But what they don't ever point out or they never bring up is the question of how the hell were these people surviving that far north, right? In the Siberian area. They had to come from somewhere, which means that they were living just fine in areas that right now are completely inhospitable to general human flourishing. And these people flourished. The people that come roaring out of the northern area, for some weird reason, magically only recently, I mean, they just come swooping down and they dominate everything in their path. And of course, eventually they end up, mixing with all kinds of cultures that they run into, either mixing, ruling, dominating, whatever. It's all over the place over there. The point is that a very basic question that is not asked when it comes to these people coming out of the north is how the hell did they survive up there? What the hell were they doing this whole time? I mean, these people are obviously very well formed. These people are not barbarians in the sense of cavemen. Barbarian, by the way, just means foreigner, just so you guys know. So that term, whenever you hear that term, in the mainstream right now, barbarian is taken as, it's a cave dude that came down with a club and just conquered everybody in a brutal fashion or whatever. That's literally how the mainstream looks at all of those kinds of peoples. And I'm being very general because this is not totally necessarily about these people, but the Iliad is sort of related to this. So actually, it's good we're talking about it. Anyway, the basic question is how the hell did those people and their culture survive up that far north for so long? And then what the hell made them come south? Nobody asked that question because they're very uncomfortable questions. How the hell was the civilization thriving up there? And why? And if they were thriving just fine, which is weird anyways, because it's cold as balls up there. I mean, why did they suddenly decide to fan out when they did? Why didn't they do that 1,000 years earlier? Why didn't they do that? It's just weird. Anyway, my point is just to show when you look at human migrations, we really have a ton of unanswered questions. And the reality also is that we don't have a lot of data for real migrations anyways. Or I should say, we do not have trustworthy data for a lot of this stuff. And of course, to make matters even worse, in today's day and age, we have a mainstream historical institution that is absolutely hell-bent on obfuscating all of this stuff. What does this have to do with the Iliad? Well, the Iliad is affected by all of these problems, and it may have the potential to solve some of these problems. Potentially. Now, it needs to be said, even if you do currently fall in the category that you believe that the Iliad is generally a fictitious work, that's okay. Even if you fall into that category, the reality is the Iliad is still very much a historical document. Wait, but it's fictitious. Yeah, even if it's fictitious, the fact that it was written, if you believe the mainstream chronology, 2,400-ish, years ago or so, depending on who you read in the mainstream. I get that there's various dates. For all of you Iliad Nazis out there, I get it. But my point is that even if it is a fictional work, it is still an insight, technically speaking, into how people were thinking back during the time that it was written. So, regardless of its fictional nature or not, we have to admit that at the very least, it will give us some sort of a window into what was important to people back then. Not only that, but the Iliad is a very, very descriptive poem. So we actually get a lot of really cool visuals out of it. Now, does that mean all the visuals, or I should say, okay, I get it. There's people out there saying, yeah, but what if the visuals are fake too? Yeah, they might be fake, but it's still an insight into what they considered art and what they considered important and what was, going on in their imaginations. It's just like if you watch some garbage Hollywood movie nowadays, right? And it's about the future or something. Yeah, it's all fictitious, but what it does is it would give you an insight into the technological technological capabilities maybe of the civilization writing that particular movie. It's still fake, but there's still something to get out of it. Anyway, okay, you get the point. I keep repeating myself because I am stupid. So now that we have established that the Iliad, even if it is fictitious, it is still valuable as a historical document, let's look at the other side of things. All right. The other side is that perhaps the Iliad is a real tale. Perhaps the Iliad is actually attempting to record an historical event. A historical event. Jesus. Is the Iliad recording a historical event? This is a fair question, and interestingly enough, if you start to go back, just say 100, 150 years from our current time, and you go and see what the children were being taught over there in Europe, and in that general area, the Iliad was taken as a actual historical event. And yeah, I get it. There's a ton of god drama in the Iliad. So is that part of the historical event? And the answer is a general no. When people were being taught, apparently, from all the research that I've seen and done, and from people who have written about it, who actually learned about it way back in the day, the Iliads, the war, the Achaeans, the Trojans, this whole situation was a legitimate historical event. It was just souped up by Homer, Homer adding all the gods and stuff like that. Because, that's what you do back in the day. You have a historical event, and then you blame everything on the gods, and then that way you are not culpable for anything because, hey, it's not my fault, bro. The gods did it. What do you want from me? Zeus made me do it. Yet it's the same thing. Well, sort of. Anyway, I don't know if that happened. I think some people do take that like that, but anyway, you get my point. The point is that yes, there are fictitious parts of it, but the actual battle stuff, the Achaeans doing stuff, the Trojans doing things, the names, the mini events, the towns, all of these other things that are very human, those were purported to be actual history. So what we end up finding with the Iliad is that, yeah, people are attributing certain acts to gods, but that part is not necessarily taken seriously. It's just like if somebody, won a World War II battle and they thanked God for it and they said, God had our back, right? And they said, oh, they even prayed before the battle and God spoke to me. Like that could actually be in the history book for that battle, but do we really believe that a God granted that particular side the victory? No, we don't. We understand that that person's religion made him say stuff like that, or that's the reason why he would have done something like that, made those quotes. But at the end of the day, it was a human situation and the battle was real, right? This is very common all over the place. You get the point. All right, so this now begs the question, why was the Iliad ever being taught as history? If you didn't know that, that's got to be kind of a wake-up call, because children back in the day, they were taught that not only the Iliad was history, but they were also taught stuff like King Arthur was history as well, right? There's a whole Welsh history that used to be taught that involved all these really cool events that is now not taught anymore and actually has been basically literally erased from history by the powers that be over there. That's a completely different subject. But my point to mention that is that only 100, 150 years ago or so, these documents that we now take, or these stories that we now take as complete fabrications, fictitious garbage basically, but to these people, this was their history. I mean, this was it. This was legitimate history. Now, nowadays, that sounds crazy. I would ask you to ask this question. Why is that so crazy? Why is it that people 100 years ago had a different version of history than what we have now? It's a legit question, and it's one you might think, well, I mean, duh, we've gotten smarter. They were cavemen, basically, 100 years ago. We now know everything about history in today's day and age. That's the position of the mainstream, right? They immediately write off anything that happened in the past, that they don't like, and they write that off as caveman religious garbage. They immediately discard it because it doesn't line up with the current mainstream chronology. It does not line up with that mainstream ideology. So it's gone. And of course, that is filtered down into everybody. And yes, everybody includes alternative researchers. So it begs a couple of questions. Why did the ancestors who lived in those areas take the Iliad seriously as serious history? And why is it that today, we now, people who are further away from these events, why do we think we know what's going on? And why do we think, or not, not we, I'm not part of this. Why does the mainstream now believe that they have the authority to completely erase and push away something like the Iliad as being a historical document? Because that's the way it's taken right now, right? And for reasons we've already discussed, right? Does that make sense? Does it make sense that people nowadays know more than the people who were closer to the history 100, 150, 300 years ago? It makes no sense. It makes zero sense at all. There had to be a reason why those people were being taught that the Iliad was historical, right? They weren't doing it just because it was, a troll or something. They were doing it because it was part of their history, right? And that makes sense. That was a lot of these stories. That's the problem. This is the problem with mythologies or fictitious epics, or I should say supposed fictitious epics. The mainstream writes off all of this stuff as pure fictional garbage because there are events going on in these stories which do not make sense to the modern mind. And that is literally it. I mean, you can literally boil it down to that. Obviously, it gets more complicated, and there's definitely a darker side here. But the fact remains that this is the position of the mainstream. And this is an intellectually and academically dishonest position to take. So we can establish right now, factually, that the mainstream's approach to works such as the Iliad is flawed. It is scientifically flawed. So if something is scientifically flawed, objectively, we can discard it. We can discard the mainstream point of view on the Iliad. And we're going to get rid of it. But for those of you who want to know, well, what the hell is the mainstream? Because I never really paid attention to the Iliad. Fair enough. Let's give a very quick rundown. So here, let's go to that bastion of truth, Wikipedia, and let's just kind of get an idea of what the mainstream thinks of the Iliad. So here we go. The Iliad and the Odyssey were likely written down in Homeric Greek, a literary mixture of Ionic Greek and other dialects, probably around the late 8th or 7th century BC. Homer's authorship was infrequently questioned in antiquity, but contemporary scholarship predominantly assumes that the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed independently and that the stories formed as part of a long oral tradition. The poem was performed by professional reciters of Homer known as rhapsodies. So the first thing to note is that the mainstream generally does not believe that an individual in the sense of Homer was the sole author of the work. Now, there's various viewpoints on this, but it's funny, actually, here's right here from Wikipedia, we immediately find a problem with reading the Iliad. The mainstream doesn't even have its own focused explanation for the story. And in fact, this is extremely important. What's important to take out of this is that mainstream historians really do make it sound like they've got all of this figured out, that the Iliad, it's mapped out, we understand it, maybe there's a few little details we have to kind of learn, but basically we're already correct, right? It's just some poem that was cobbled together over hundreds of years, and then, Homer's attributed to it, but the reality is someone eventually just wrote it down, it survived thousands of years through oral tradition, and now we have it, right? And it's all fiction. This really does shine light on mainstream's problem with all kinds of historical crap, but in this case, they actually do not have any kind of a locked down creation of the Iliad. The mainstream literally does not know where it comes from. But they say stuff like this, and your average person who reads this little blurb on Wikipedia is going to get the impression that mainstream historians basically have this stuff figured out. And they're going to move on with life. Nobody's going to sit there and really question any of this. But as we can see, it takes even the most basic of questions to find and tease out the fact that the mainstream doesn't have a lock on where this poem came from. This is an important point to think about. The reason why it's important is because there's actually interesting scholarship that does not put the Iliad's events in Greece or Turkey, more to the point, but it puts the Iliad's events up in Northern Europe. Yeah, how do you like that? There is literally an entire school of thought that believes and can prove and has evidence for the story of the Iliad taking place up there in the European area, up in the British Isle area, the North Sea area. Yeah, that is not really ever brought to the forefront when anybody talks about it, which is unfortunate, because the reality is there is just as much, if not maybe more evidence to support the fact that the Iliad takes place up in Northern Europe and not in the Aegean or Mediterranean area. Now, we'll get into some details to substantiate that claim, but just to set the stage, that's how little we truly know or have a grasp on the Iliad. And I don't just mean, mainstream people don't have a good grasp. I'm talking about real, I hate to even use the term alternative research, but let's just say real researchers, any researcher really. We don't have the smoking guns that really pinpoint all the locations of where the Iliad took place, if it took place. We don't have all the evidence to substantiate the claim that the Iliad is a historical document because we can't tell where it took place. So how does that work in favor for us as historians, right? Why am I bringing this up? Did I already shoot down this entire discussion? No, we have a long way to go. And we're going to ramble through this whole damn thing because nobody else has anything else to do and I'm bored anyway. So we're going to keep talking about this crap. All right. So right now, the next question you should have is, wait, you just said that this was a potentially historical document, but now you're telling me that we don't know anything about it. So how could it be historical? And that is the point. The problem is that the Iliad is one hell of a story. It's a huge story. It is an epic in the truest sense. But what this shows is that we really do not have a good grasp of all of the details of the Iliad. And one of those details is actually one of the very simple ones. When did it take place? Yeah, we actually do not have any kind of a grasp on when this poem was either A, written, and if it's real, B, when the events took place. The funny part about that whole thing is that the mainstream cannot come out and just say, we have no idea, because that is really all that they should be saying. It's ridiculous that they try to place this 8th and 7th century BC onto the Iliad. The whole thing is ridiculous. Even from just reading mainstream material, while they don't tell you up front, the reality is what they're saying in between the lines is ultimately, we have no idea. We have no clue what's going on with the Iliad, where it took place, when it was written, how the hell it was translated down to us, etc. It's an entire mystery. So that's extremely interesting in my opinion, and it does go a long way to outlining the main point of what I wanted to talk about on this show, and that is we don't really know, technically speaking, enough about the Iliad to make the claims that are generally made nowadays. Now the good news is that there are a lot of other scholars and historians which have attempted to stay objective, and they have gone into that, and their findings come out to something completely different. And I mean, we're about to get into some unbelievably crazy stuff here, and I'm already talking like 20 plus minutes. I'm gonna go through and pull out some of the main crazier details that I wanted to cover, and then in other shows we'll go into those details. All right, let's do that because this is gonna take some time. So now that we have basically established the scientific fact that we have no clue about where the Iliad came from, what year it was composed, how it was transmitted through apparently all these thousands of years to get to us today, and ultimately where it would have taken place if it was indeed describing real events. So let's tackle some of this. Let's start with the first thing I just said. I mean, basically, anytime anybody tries to talk to you about the Iliad and they start speaking in a way that makes it sound like they've got this all figured out and they've locked it down, like, oh my god, some of these Iliad quote unquote experts, oh, they're insufferable, man. You just want to reach out and just start choking me. and just slap them, just it's unbelievably frustrating to listen to some of these Iliad scholars or Iliad and Odyssey scholars, whatever the hell they call themselves. It's ridiculous to listen to these people and have them talk like all of this stuff has been figured out. We have none of this. We have no clue about any of this, and it takes all of 2 seconds to assault and attack those people's ideology and tear it down. Right, so just remember that, because I'm not going to go into great detail about the basics of the Iliad. There are other channels that have done that way better, but just be careful. Or watch for them. Watch for key ways that these people will speak. These people will speak in a completely, authoritative, from a position of ultimate knowledge. They know all about this, and what they're saying has already been proven. And if you think anything else, you're wrong, and that's ridiculous. You know for a scientific fact that there is, as far as I know, nobody that can speak to the Iliad on that level of factual evidence. Factual evidence that's like all evidence should be factual, right? You can't have, anyway, okay, so, moving on. And if you just thought, oh, now this random YouTube dude is about to tell me that he knows everything going on, not at all. What I want to do in this discussion is I just want to point out some of the inconvenient truths for mainstream people, and then people who are truly looking for the truth, people who want the truth, I want to show you maybe certain perspectives that you have not seen before, and especially for those of you who have never really looked into the Iliad, because the Iliad, it's always portrayed as a fictional garbage situation. Especially nowadays. We had that terrible Iliad movie, I don't know what it was called a while ago, that Troy movie, Jesus Christ. Anyway, don't watch TV, it's bad for you. Okay, anyway, let's keep moving. Alright, so, we gotta start somewhere, so let's start with the question of, where did Troy take place? Let's start there. There's interesting things that we'll get towards the end that are way cooler than this. But the first question is, where did Troy take place? And for all of you smartasses that just stood up and were like, well, duh, dude, Heinrich Schliemann found Troy in the 1870s. And Troy is, of course, in the northwest corner of modern-day Turkey. I mean, everybody knows that. What is this question? What are you talking about? Where did it take place? It's in Greece, damn it. Really? We sure about that? The Heinrich Schliemann find is the reason why people will now believe that Troy did indeed take place in Greece. And it's kind of been like that since the 1870s. All right, so let's get into this right off the bat. Troy disappeared until the 1870s? Like, it took thousands of years for people to remember or find where Troy was. Even more interesting, the people that lived there, they didn't know that was Troy. They were not aware that that is where the Iliad took place. All the natives around there, that's a problem. I mean, and it's funny that it's a problem at all. I mean, how the hell do we lose really famous, important cities when people are still living around in the area, but somehow the entire memory of this just goes away? Nobody knows what anybody's talking about. Oh, and for whatever reason, the city was also entirely buried in, just a couple thousand years. The whole situation doesn't make sense. So Heinrich Schliemann finds, quote-unquote, Troy. Not only does he find Troy, but he finds like 7 or 9 Troys or something like that. There are literally multiple Troys layered on top of one another. So right now we got to be thinking like, wait. Okay. The reality is your average person will hear that statement and they will think it makes sense, because they will think, oh yeah, well, duh. I mean, stratigraphically, that's how stuff works, right? You have one civilization and then magically, a layer of dirt and rock appear on it. Then there's another civilization that builds on top of that. Then a magic layer of dirt and rock appears there. And for Troy, quote unquote Troy, this happened 7 times at least. So what? It's ridiculous. That's the first problem right off the bat that you really should raise eyebrows. If Troy is indeed only a couple thousand years old, between 2,000 and 3,000, we'll get to the time period in the next question. How about that? But only, let's take worst case scenario, like 3,000 years ago. Let's just take that, a nice round number. If Troy took place 3,000 years ago, how the hell and where the hell did layers of dirt and rock come to bury 7 different Troys? It's dumb. Like, the whole thing is stupid, and it already points to a completely different situation happening in the area if we look at the science of stratigraphy. And then, to make matters worse, and here's the main important part about this particular subject, is that Heinrich Schliemann's claim that he found Troy, it's actually pretty dubious at best. People roll with it now because it's had time to ferment in history books. It's had time to sit there and rot in history books. And so, of course, many generations have now come, since Heinrich Schliemann found this place. And so people were just taught over time that, yeah, that's Troy. And it just kind of solidified itself into mainstream history as that being a factual find. All right. But here's the reality. Heinrich Schliemann's find doesn't add up. There is no grand city there that looks anything like what Homer, we'll just use Homer for right now as the author. There is no evidence of a amazingly huge, powerful, great city with wide roads, huge walls, etc., on the scale of what is described in the Iliad. It doesn't exist. The reality is, if Troy was as marvelous as it's described in the poem, we really should find something else there. There really should be a different kind of evidence present. We don't find that. The town that Troy found is barely a town. I mean, you can call it sort of a town, I guess, but it's not. It's nothing like what the poem describes. This is problem 1. Of course, problem 2 is that there's 7 of them, maybe more, apparently, that are all built on top of each other, which also doesn't make any sense, because then, so you're talking they're conquered, then they're buried, and then what happens after that, right? There's no history for any of that. There's nothing that explains all of these other versions of Troy. And you would think there would be a history because people still lived in the area. It's not like Troy was defeated and then everybody just completely left Turkey for 1,000 years. Like, that is literally how history is taught nowadays. It's hilarious how disconnected history is taught in that sense. It's like, oh, the Roman Empire fell and then nothing happened for 1,000 years, and then people suddenly came back and then restarted the empire right where it left off. It's just absolutely dumb. But people don't think about this. So with the Troy situation, the entire area was not abandoned permanently for thousands of years. People continued to exist and live there. Where the hell is the history then that all of these people should have, to some degree or another, that would support any of that? Any of Heinrich Schliemann's findings? It doesn't work. The other part, and the worst part, and the most damning part of Heinrich Schliemann's little excavation over there, is that it was done horribly. Actually, no, wait, before we get into the crappy part of the way he did this, what's even funnier is that Heinrich Schliemann went down to specifically find Troy. So remember, his goal was to locate Troy, and he was not coming back until he had found what he was looking for. Every single person who operates in the realm of real science right now, your eyebrows should have been raised, because we all know that is not how science is done. And archaeology is a science. You do not go out of your way to force and prove your postulate. You just follow the evidence wherever it takes you. So when Schliemann went down there looking for Troy, he was going to find Troy. Like, it didn't matter where he went. He could have gone to the middle of Egypt. He would have found Troy. He was going to be coming back, writing down that he discovered that town or that city, right? And he did. That's exactly what happened. What he went to do, he did it. That's not how this is done. The next problem then, of course, is to say, well, how do you know he didn't do it? Well, we've already covered some of the reasons, but here's the next problem with Schliemann's archaeology, is that he didn't do it in a scientific manner. There are pictures of his archaeological dig. You can see how little care was done to truly do any real scientific archaeology. and this is the truth. Basically, he gets a bunch of locals to just start digging and finding stuff, and they do. The other thing that you will also see from these pictures is that not everything is dug up. What that means basically is that parts of Troy were still peeking up through the ground. So it really begs the question, how the hell was Troy lost? If ruins are still popping up from the ground and the locals knew about it, it's not like nobody knew these things existed, right? I mean, locals pass by this crap every day. In fact, they probably use some of the stuff to build their own crap or whatever. This was not hidden. It was right there. So how the hell could Troy have been lost if it was never technically lost? It doesn't make any sense. And that's the problem with Troy, and that is the problem with what Schliemann claims to be Troy. This city was technically never lost, and nobody called it Troy. The only thing that even came close to connecting it with Troy was the term Ilum. Ilum basically just means the flank of a city. It does not specify Troy in the sense of that specific city. And there's a lot of scholarship that goes into all of this, and I won't get into it now, but the main point of all of this is just to set the stage for at least having a foundation to question where the Iliad takes place. So basically, what we come out with this, as far as location-wise goes, is that there is no real reason to believe that this particular finding that Heinrich Schliemann found and dug up is the true city of Troy, right? There's no reason to believe that. He did it. It's all bad. Like, his archaeology is bad. His motives were bad. How it went down is bad. It's all extremely suspect at the very least. And this is a fact. It's a scientific fact. So now that we have a scientific, factually based claim that we don't know, or at the very least, Troy did not take place right now where the mainstream says it took place. All right, so that sets the stage for at least that. So we can move Troy. That means we have to put Troy somewhere else, because the current place, it doesn't work. It doesn't line up with anything. Now, I know you can also argue with me really quick on saying, well, maybe Homer, he elaborated the city. What if the city really wasn't that grand or that crazy? What if the city really didn't have wide streets and all of that stuff? And to that, I would say, why would I believe that? I mean, if we're going to listen to the story, let's take what we can at face value, right? I mean, the only real main thing that we need to rightfully be cautious around is the God stuff. So actually, now that we're talking about the God part, let's get into that. All right, so Troy, we don't know where it technically is right now. Could still be in the Mediterranean. Let's put a pin on that for right now, though. Okay, so we don't know where it's at. The next problem in the story with regards to Troy is the fact that when we start reading it, if we're going to take details of it seriously, for example, in describing the city, which I believe we should do, then why are we not taking the God portion seriously either? Now, this is where it gets a little weird, but it also runs concurrent with our rule on this channel that whenever we hear the term God, we try to substitute the word God with cosmological event or body. You do this and things change. Now, the interesting thing about the Iliad is that we do indeed find gods doing all kinds of things, but one of the main things that we also find is that gods are doing something up in the sky. Now, this is the important part so far as we're really concerned when it comes to catastrophism. Because when we hear gods doing something up in the sky and it's affecting Earth, or even if it's not affecting Earth, if our ancestors are recording something going on up in the sky, there's generally a good chance that they were recording something they actually saw happen. Now, there is a problem with the Iliad, and I need to get it out there really quick. So when we analyze other kinds of historical mythologies, or whatever, right? We listen to other cultures and they start talking about the gods doing stuff up in the sky. Generally, those stories are very direct in how they are describing what's going on cosmologically. There might be a little bit of interaction with the humans in the form of maybe somebody sort of says a god talks or something like that. But generally, the events that these cultures describe happening, they are very much relegated to the sky, and they're separate from humans in the sense that they are not one-on-one interacting with people. I get that there are stories like that, but those stories generally take a different tone and flavor, and those are probably more generally, the fantasy type of stuff. We have to be careful with this. The problem with the Iliad is the Iliad just has tons of god drama in it. It's not just that we find stuff going on up in the sky, which is what we are going to focus on, but we also find the gods, interacting one-on-one with a lot of the main characters of the story. And those interactions are generally not cataclysmic. Those interactions are generally very mortal or very magical, right? I mean, we have Aphrodite helping Paris go get his woman, right? Through magic. Like, that's what she does. How do we square that cosmologically? I don't have an answer right off the bat, although the more I read this stuff, the more I'm starting to wonder. Okay, well, anyway, we'll get to that later. That's a different show. Anyway, my point is that I understand if you're wondering, well, okay, there's a lot of... I get that we do the planet thing in the sky, but there's too much God stuff. Like, how do we square all of that? And I don't have an answer for that. Or at least I do not have a complete answer. I do have a partial answer. Because one of the main takeaways that we should be getting from the Iliad, from a historical sense, hopefully, is the story describes a lot of very intricate historical details in the story. By that I mean you get all kinds of amazing descriptions about armor, swords, tactics, how the war was fought, etc. You get a lot of that kind of detail, and that detail is valuable, especially if it's coming from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, depending on whatever camp you're in. We'll change that here as well towards the end of the show. We'll give a different date as well. We'll just set the stage. So because we do indeed find a lot of detail written into the poem, it begs the question, is this stuff historically accurate? I mean, it's a legitimate question, and I think even mainstream historians, to one degree or another, actually agree and do say, yes, a lot of these descriptions are valuable from a historical perspective. So when they're talking about the battles, the armor, the weapons, the people, etc., the down-to-earth stuff, let's put it like that, that stuff might actually have intrinsic historical value. But then the other side, so we get that kind of cool detail, but then of course we jump into crazy God stuff. So how do we balance this? I mean, what do we take as potentially real versus what is potentially fictitious? And this is a problem, and I don't have it solved, and I haven't seen anybody solve it yet. In fact, I really haven't seen anybody really even attempt to acknowledge this question exists. Maybe somebody's done it. I just haven't seen it in all the stuff that I've read and studied yet. But it's a legitimate question, and it is a legitimate problem that we have to deal with. So here's what I would say. What I'm going to say is that for right now, for this show that is already going too long anyways, and wasting all of our time, is that right now the general basic human interactions with gods that take place in a very mortal situation, let's put that stuff to the side for right now. So like I said, for example, Aphrodite coming down and helping Paris. Let's put that to the side for right now. What we do want to focus on is when we start finding Homer talking about the battlefields. Now, when he starts talking about the battlefields, one of the things that is happening, aside from everybody killing each other, is that the gods are fighting up in the sky. Now, this is probably the main reason why the Iliad suddenly became important to me, because anytime we can find stories, mythologies, histories, whatever, that start talking about what gods do up in the sky and how they affect the planet Earth, this might actually have some very real scientific and historical data built into it. And the Iliad might have this as well. Now, I got introduced to this particular situation through Immanuel Velikovsky. In his Worlds in Collision book, he brings it up. And I found that fascinating because I had never even thought about any of this stuff. So to see Velikovsky especially go into it and then pick it apart and come out with some legitimate scientific, cosmological, historical information was an eye-opener. I'm not going to go into the details right now because we'll make that a different show, because there's a lot of really fun stuff in there that might probably will help a lot of you guys out who are trying to figure out stuff that was going on in the area at the time. So we'll go into more depth in a different show. Anyway, the point is that historians and people started to notice that things in the Iliad may actually make sense on a cosmological level. Now this is interesting because then this may actually help us date the Iliad when we compare it to other mythologies that talk about the same kinds of events going on up in the sky. That's really valuable. And that's another show. Holy crap. But anyway, that's one of the things that the Iliad probably brings to the table with respect to historicity. Like, that is why we need to pay attention to it. Okay, so we've established that we do not know where Troy was. We do not have a locked down location for where these events took place. We've proven that scientifically. We also have enough evidence to support the point of view that the Iliad may actually be a historical document in some sense or another. That we cannot discard the Iliad as simply a work of fiction because we know for a fact that it used to be taught as a legitimate historical event that was important to the cultures that were learning it. You know, this was not just for fun. It was not just because the curriculum people wanted to be douchebags, you know, and make it hard for students to pass. It was in the curriculum because it was an important part of their history. Now, the interesting part about this is that it's not just an interesting part about Greek history, but we find it being an important part in European history, and this is where we find it being taught as well. Right? Students even had to translate the poems in grade school and all of that. It was pretty damn important. It's not important anymore. Nobody learns about it nowadays. So what that tells us is that it tells us that people, at the very least, used to believe that their ancestors had recorded an actual event. So that lends credence for us to pay attention to all the other cosmological stuff going on, because there might actually be some truth there. All right, so we've got all of those things in there. The next problem is that we do not know when Troy took place. Now, I haven't talked about that yet, so let's do it. All right, so when did Troy take place? We don't know. I mean, there's the answer. We don't know. No, anybody that tells you that they know for sure the date of when Troy took place, just literally, oh my God, just walk. You know what? Be peaceful. Don't slap them. Don't choke them. Just walk away. Just move on with life. We'll be zen. We'll be better people about it. All right. But here's the truth. We don't know. Even more funny, and to prove the point that we don't know, is that when you go study, like if you start in the mainstream arena of the Iliad, you're going to find two schools of thought on when Troy took place. You're going to find people that believe it took place in 1200 BC, and then you're going to find people that think it took place, you know, between 600-700 BC. That's a pretty big gap. I mean, that's a serious gap. Historians have no problem saying this stuff because it's pretty difficult to prove, especially using mainstream chronology and all of that. So they can say it, and they can get away with it, and they can continue to publish papers, and they can continue to reference their buddies, and their buddies will reference them, and they'll just be happy and rich, and they'll treat all of you like garbage. You see my point? Even in the mainstream, there is no consensus on when Troy took place. There's also no consensus on when Homer lived. They think 400-ish BC, fine. But you, once again, in the mainstream arena, you will find multiple dates there as well. Right? We do not have a date. And I think we don't have a date. I mean, I don't know what else to say. There is no date for any of this. If we don't have any dates, I mean, that's a problem. We have to pay attention to that. We can't, especially if people are teaching the Iliad as a legitimate history. Now, we'll get more into that later as well. I'm not going into details here right now, but isn't that interesting? If you're going to teach it as a legitimate history, but you don't have a date for the event, how do you do that? That's also a legitimate question, right? The whole Iliad thing is insane. We don't know anything about it. But if you were to, when you read the mainstream garbage, they've got it all figured out. But here, we've just proven that they don't. I mean, there's nothing here. You cannot make a conclusion. The only thing that every single Iliad researcher should come out with is saying, I have no idea. I have no idea where this is. I have no idea who wrote it. That brings us up to the other point, actually. Who then wrote it? So, generally, Homer is attributed to writing the work. Fine. But even the mainstream doesn't necessarily believe that, as we just read in the Wikipedia garbage thing. Right? Even they are not on board necessarily with Homer writing all of that, and for good reason. The reason why they at least they do admit this, is because the poem is huge. I mean, it's a huge poem, relatively speaking. I'm not saying that somebody could not memorize that entire poem and then, carry it down the generations. I'm not saying that's not possible, but it would be one hell of a challenge. So in the Wikipedia thing we read, they say, well, multiple bards kind of, used it, added on to it, etc., until one day it was finally, written down and solidified. Right? The reason why this route has to be said, even by the mainstream, is because we have no idea how it transmitted down to us. We don't know. We're guessing it's oral. There could have been books. We don't know. We have no clue. We don't have any of the evidence that supports either route. That's a problem. So isn't this interesting that we have this epic poem that may contain real historical facts about, one hell of an interesting time, as well as containing cosmological events that would have been affecting our ancestors during this time, and nobody knows who wrote it, nobody knows the year of which it took place, and nobody knows where it even happened. I don't know what to say about that. I mean, look at that. That's ridiculous. This is why the Iliad is important, though, because if we can lock down all of those problems that I just talked about, that may actually get us closer to the truth about all kinds of other events that took place on the Earth. And by other events, what I mean is the catastrophes, or at the very least, the maybe calmer times of the catastrophes that our ancestors would have gone through in between the major events. Because, okay, and here's what I mean by that. So, here right now on this channel, we look towards the electric universe, plasma physics. We look at Velikovskyism, etc. We just follow the science, and what we find is that Earth was dealing with other cosmological bodies in its very recent past. I'm talking just a few thousand years ago, and these dealings were near misses with other planets. Basically, Mars, Venus, etc. We literally were dealing with the orbits of other planets getting in the way of ours, and vice versa, right? So anyway, we know all this crazy stuff was going on, but and we know that the Earth went through some unbelievably destructive cataclysms. But what happens in between? The in-between is just as important as trying to lock down the real high points of the cataclysm. I get the feeling that perhaps, maybe, the Iliad is one of these stories that takes place in between some of these major cataclysms. And we'll get into those details later, but that might be the case. All right, we're going pretty damn long here. Screw it. Let's wrap this up, and then we'll do more episodes later that get into each individual detail. Because this stuff is crazy. It's well worth learning, and it's well worth digging into. Even if it's all fiction, don't forget, if it's all fiction, there's still data in there for you as a historian. Now, one last thing before we shut this garbage down. There's one other very interesting possibility that deals with the Iliad, and this has to do with when did it take place. Now, I know we've already kind of talked about that, but it gets even stranger. What if I told you that the Iliad was not written or composed in BC time periods, but what if it was composed in an AD time period? Even more interesting, what if that period wasn't, say, 1800 years ago? What if the Iliad was composed only, say, 800 or 700 years ago? To make matters even more interesting, that would also mean that the possibility of whatever Troy was, and whatever that event truly was, what if that didn't take place in the BC time era either? What if the events in the Iliad took place in the first millennium AD? And this does not account for real chronology either. Troy, the story of the Iliad, and Homer, or whoever ended up writing the Iliad, all of these people in these events, they may only be maybe 900 years ago and not thousands upon thousands of years ago. And there is scientific proof that can substantiate that claim. And we will go into that possibility as well in another show. So go do something better with your life. Shut this garbage off. I'm not done with this crap.